Welcome, ladies and gentlemen of the internet, to the fourth episode of the Liberty Cadre podcast. I am your host, the Liberty Ambassador, Matthew Cobb, alongside the wonderful, glorious, hashtag Slay Queen editor of the Liberty Cadre, Nzinga Johnson. And there's been a lot of things going on in the news, as there always is with this 24/7 never-ending news cycle. We've got a couple particularly pertinent things that we're going to talk about today, starting with the red flag laws. We'll get to that in a moment, but we're also going to talk about incidents going on in Hong Kong. So let's start talking about the red flag laws. So basically, they've been in the news a lot recently as a result of these kind of mass shootings. And specifically the ones for people who've been living under a rock, the ones that happened in Ohio and in
El Paso.
A little over a week ago now. And basically, a lot of politicians on both sides have come out kind of putting them out there as a potential solution to kind of this mass shooting.
Yeah.
Some people are calling it an epidemic. I'm not sure statistically it's necessarily accurate to call it that, but it's definitely a problem. So Nzinga, what do you know about red flag laws, and what do you think their validity is?
So I'm kind of new to the political scene, to the conservative scene. I don't own any guns, although I hope to have one. So I'd never heard of them before. But from my understanding, this is the way a friend of mine put it to me, and you tell me if this is accurate.
All right.
And I actually tweeted this out, and it went over well. I'm black, in the black community.
Really? You are? I had no idea.
Some people call me cinnamon. So, because I'm black, and statistically speaking, crime is worse in the black community. A judge can use a red flag law and say, oh, because of these statistics, we are taking away your right to own a firearm.
There's, I want to say about 8 different states have red flag laws in place. The first 2 to do it were Connecticut and Indiana. Connecticut has had one in place since about 1999. And they really kind of vary in the specifics as far as who is allowed to actually make these requests. But you're pretty much right in the general idea, which is that it allows kind of relatives or basically associates of someone to go to the authorities and say, hey, I think this person may be a danger to themselves and others, or committing violence, and I think they ought to, because of that, should have their weapons taken away. And the laws, again, vary on state to state on specifically what the process is after that. There's some where they actually have to have a little bit more solid evidence, and there's kind of hearings and things like that. And then there's others where I want to say there was actually an incident in Florida where the guy had no idea he'd even been reported, and the cops came into his place of residence, raided his house at 5 a.m. in the morning. So there's differing situations, and I know at what they're discussing at the federal level now, it's hard to really say kind of whether we ought to support or oppose what they're doing at the federal level, because there's not really been a bill that's come out yet addressing any specifics. Personally, I'm a little bit mixed on the idea of red flag laws. I think the intentions are, from most people, are good in the sense that they've probably seen some of the stories about like, well, we've seen each of these shooters like where friends or family reported them, or you could look at their social media and tell that they were probably going to do something dangerous, and some people are probably coming at it from the perspective of, well, if it's obvious to seemingly everyone around these people that they're getting ready to do something dangerous, and we can take their weapons away from them, why not do so? But I think the problem is that with any sorts of law, there's trade-off. If you've got something where you're actually going through all of due process, and they're actually, they have to have hearings first, and not just some person comes and makes a complaint, the person who's being for lack of a better word, accused, doesn't even know that they're under suspicion, and then the police come and raid their house at 5 a.m. without them even knowing about it. Like, that's not something I can support, and I don't think, at least I hope, that's not something that Dan Crenshaw supports. And I guess the more I think about it, the more concerned I get, because I really don't see any variation of this where due process rights are respected. I read a piece in the National Review earlier today written by Thomas Massey and John Lott, I believe was the other gentleman's name, but basically talking about how, well, basically you can't really have real due process with any sort of red flag laws, because at best, okay, you get someone who's under suspicion and arrested, but they get their guns taken away at that point before they even getting convicted of a crime, which is very different from how we treat other things that are supposed to be rights.
Right.
For example, if someone gets arrested, we're not going to tell them that they can't post on social media or that they can't speak their mind about something, and freedom of speech is a right too.
Right.
And I understand that gun rights guns are more dangerous in the immediate sense than just being able to speak, but at the same time, if we're going to treat them as a constitutional right, which constitutionally is what they are, they're a constitutional right, then it should be fundamentally treated like speech.
I agree with that. The other issue that I kind of have is, let's say you crack and you start saying weird things, and you've got like an arsenal at home, and your mom and dad are like, oh my God, my son is crazy, and he's talking about killing people, whoever, whatever. I was going to name groups, but I'm not going to name groups. Like, if they were in good with a town judge or something like that, they could go ahead and get that done quickly. Or if you were completely sane and they got mad at you for whatever, they could get that judge to make a ruling on your sanity. So I'm like, well, I just don't see how moral laws is going to help. I see how it's going to hurt more so than it's going to help, because if people are criminals, whether we enact red flag laws and take their guns away, well, they're criminal in nature, right? So they already are planning on doing something wrong or committing crimes. So they could either go get those things illegally, they can go buy weapons illegally and still do whatever it was they were planning on doing. And then on the other hand, are we judging someone or making judgments about someone from a legal standpoint, something they didn't do? Like, is that what we're going to be doing now?
Yeah, I mean, that's my concern, is that you're basically taking people's rights away before you're actually convicting them of it again. And again, I understand that you want to try to stop these events before they happen, but it's not really the job of the government or really even the police to really try to stop people before they even start to commit a crime. Like, it's just like, I've heard people try to argue that, you know, the police and government should be proactive instead of reactive. Well, I mean, a rights violation thing is by nature reactive. I mean, because until someone actually does something, I mean, they by definition haven't done anything. Like, they're innocent until they've actually done something that's a crime. And that another thing to keep in mind is that, and Thomas Massey, I believe, brought this point up in the National Review article, is that one potential trade-off that you have from this sort of law is that people might be less inclined, if they've got some sort of kind of mental illness or something going on, or troubled in some way, that it's contributing to them wanting to do whatever crime they're planning to commit, is that they might be less likely to seek help, because now they know that doing so puts their gun rights at risk. The biggest question we have to answer is, would this even, if they're put into place, would this even work? And the data that we have on them for mass shootings, at least as far as I could tell, is pretty inconclusive. Like, most of the laws, I want to say, like, at least there's several of them that have only been put into place the last 2 years, so we really don't have really good data on which to kind of measure whether they work or not in those cases. And as far as the data I could find on the places like Connecticut and Indiana that had them in place longer, I didn't really see anyone making the argument that they had actually reduced mass shootings. Most of the data that I found that had studied that was things dealing with suicides, and the data on that was kind of inconclusive. And this is really why it's important to kind of read studies in detail whenever you see the media report on them, because NBC News put out a story about one of these studies with the headline saying that red flag laws do reduce gun violence, but not in the way that you might think. And it basically goes on to claim in the story, it cites this one particular study, and it talks about how there was all these percentage reductions in gun suicide rates. Mm-hmm. But what it doesn't mention, and what you find if you actually go read the study, is that while it did reduce gun violence suicides, only in Indiana, because in Indiana and Connecticut were the only states on which they had actual measurable data. Mm-hmm. In Indiana, there was a reduction in overall suicides that was that the authors of the study attributed to the red flag laws. But in the case of Connecticut, suicides overall actually went up after the laws, and even the authors of the study, who, from what I could tell reading it, seemed to be pro-red flag laws, even they had to admit, based on their study, that the red flag laws likely caused that increase in suicide rates in Connecticut. So I think the best we can say, if we're being honest about it, is that the data doesn't really tend to show a kind of clear conclusion on whether these work in either direction, as far as preventing mass shootings or even preventing or overall lowering suicides. So I think there's a lot of questions as to whether or not they actually work. There's a lot of concern as far as gun rights, and I'd be very very skeptical of any sort of law that comes out, especially, and they really can't pass constitutionally, they really can't pass any sort of red flag law at the federal level without violating the 10th Amendment. So yeah, that's pretty much my viewpoint on it, is at the very least, I'd have to see specifics in legislation that could convince me that they're actually going to have due process of law, mm-hmm. and that there's going to be very strict protections, and that we're going to be very specific on exactly who can put in these requests or who can file for these sort of restraining orders, for lack of a better term, and actually what procedures are in place to protect the gun owner.
I just don't think that we should look to the government to help us with a cultural problem. Politics is downstream from culture, so it happens in the communities first, and then it gets to politics, and then we can't keep worshiping politicians so much, hoping to God that they fix things in our culture, because it's not going to happen, ever.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and it's just, we keep, and I'm actually looking here at a National Council for Behavioral Health report that is kind of looking, it's an in-depth report talking about mass violence in America kind of in general. And I hadn't made my way all the way through it, but it states at several points, it makes pretty clear that there's not really one easy solution or cause that you can point to for all these mass shootings, because it's a combination of factors that make people do these sorts of things, because you can apply the same stressors to some people and it might set them off, and you apply those same stressors to other people and they might not set them off.
Right.
I think we maybe overstate the mental health aspect of a little bit, and that's kind of something that you and I were talking about last week, is I think a lot of people, particularly on our side on the right, because I think people, again, are coming at it from a place of good intentions, because they hear the left talking about every time one of these mass shootings happens, oh, we need gun control, and people on our side not wanting to just kind of be silent and throw up our hands and say there's nothing we can do, will say, oh, well, we have a mental health problem in this country. And we very well may. But I think as far as actually kind of diagnosable mental health illnesses, some of these mass shooters have had some have not. We wouldn't really even know, because most of them never sought mental health treatment, so it's hard to really say if they had a diagnosable mental illness or not. And it's possible for people to have kind of really dangerous ideologies and be kind of in a dark place mentally, without being mentally ill as a psychiatrist or someone who, or how a professional would define as mentally ill.
Right.
So, and I think that's something we have to be careful for, because I think there's just a tendency on pretty much whether it's the left with gun control or whether it's other people on our side or even just kind of everybody with mental illness, that we all want to boil this, because these mass shootings are so terrible, they're such terrible events, that we all want to just be able to boil it down to one simple thing, and hey, if we just fix this, then that'll make all of this go away. And it's just not that simple.
Mm-hmm. And there's a little bit of an agenda as well, because statistically, people get beat up by hands and feet and die from that more than guns. And I'm like, we're gonna ban hands and feet? We're gonna put red flag laws on hands and feet? You know?
And it's kind of like how, and this kind of goes a little bit past the red flag laws we've been talking about.
Yeah.
If you're going like to say like banning firearms in total, but you basically, firearms from my understanding are more or less banned in the UK, and now they're having problems with knife attacks, and you have the mayor of London and other people over there trying to ban knives, and it's the sort of thing like there's a certain point, like I can understand the logic of people being like, well, the problem with guns is that it's so easy to kill mass amounts of people easily. So I can understand kind of why you might think that, well, at least if you get rid of the guns, you limit the amount of damage that could be done or what have you. Mm-hmm. But at a certain point, like there's always going to be a certain amount of violence that you're going to have in society that, I mean, like you don't want to just tolerate and like completely ignore it, but from a government perspective, like there's only so much you can do. The reality of evil, I think, is something that people of all walks of life just have trouble confronting. At a certain point, everybody's responsible for their own actions and their own ideas. And at a certain, there's certain things you can do to mitigate certain behaviors, but you're never going to completely eliminate the possibility of people just being able to go out and kill somebody. And I think we've kind of delved into this topic sufficiently, so let's move on.
Okay, so the Hong Kong protests. So interesting. I learned a lot when I was looking up this story. It's really, really interesting. So pretty much what's happening is Hong Kongers, I think that's what you call them, right?
Maybe Hong Kongians.
I'm going to call them citizens of Hong Kong.
Yeah, I don't know what the official name for them is.
There was a video I watched that kept calling them Hong Kongers, and that seems so weird to me. So I'm going to call them citizens of Hong Kong. So pretty much the fight is over how much power does China have in Hong Kong. Now, personally, I have never been very interested in China unless I was eating or Bruce Lee movies. So this pretty much all started with a murder. All of the protests. So what happened is this couple, this boyfriend and girlfriend, they go from Hong Kong to Taiwan, and they're there for like, I don't know, some time.
Free China, as my dad calls Taiwan.
Yeah, they're in free China, and only one of them comes back. The boyfriend kills the pregnant girlfriend. And so he goes back to Hong Kong, but Hong Kong can't send him to Taiwan because there's no extradition agreement. And so China's like, I have an idea. We'll write up an extradition agreement. And Hong Kong's like, oh, no, you won't. So here's the history behind Hong Kong and China and their relationship. So since like the 1800s, the UK had control over Hong Kong. It was like their little colony. But in 1997, there was an agreement between China, Hong Kong, and the British that China, you can have Hong Kong back, but it'll be a one country, two system type of agreement, which means that Hong Kong is a democracy. Hong Kong is a lot more free. They have freedom of speech. They have freedom of the press. They have freedom to assembly. A lot of kind of the same things that we have.
I think something that's really important to note is how economically free they are. If I remember this correctly, I think the Heritage Foundation had them listed as the freest economy in the world on the Economic Freedom Index. So that's, and just for perspective, the United States as of 2019, I want to say we are 12th on that list. In addition to all those freedoms that you were just talking about, Nzinga, they're one of the most prosperous economies in the world. And it's because, to a large degree, that their economy is so free and has so few restrictions that they've been able to accomplish that.
Yeah, well, China is not feeling it at all. China wants to change that. And so the agreement is that Hong Kong would operate under a high degree of autonomy from China. And the citizens have the right to vote. Like I said, free speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly. Well, that's all supposed to end in 2047. So China will have full control of Hong Kong, supposedly, according to the agreement, by 2047. Well, I think I'm saying his name right. I'll just say President Jinping.
I can't confirm if that's the correct pronunciation.
Xi Jinping. He is not waiting for 2047. So this is what has been happening in the last few years. So 9 pro-democracy activists were arrested in Hong Kong in 2017. And then this is kind of...
What was the official reason for their arrest?
I don't know. I didn't even read that. I know that's bad, but I didn't. But the one I did look into a little bit more, because I thought it was really interesting, is that in 2018, 5 booksellers disappeared. So they were all Chinese guys, but they were like Swedish nationals and stuff like that, and they just started disappearing. And all Hong Kongers know that China has something to do with it. I never got around knowing why those booksellers. So I'm not sure why, but everyone pretty much knows that the Chinese secret police is involved in this, that's darn scary, I have to say. Like, that's foreign to me because I live in America, where if you get arrested, you were involved in something or doing something or looked like someone that was doing something. Never just because you were selling books.
Yeah, I mean, and plus in the United States, like, generally speaking, people don't just disappear. Like, if you, like, there's some sort of record.
Not from the government.
Yeah, not from the, or at least not knowingly from the government. But I mean, generally, like, there's some sort of records of what happens to people.
In China, they would never be able to talk about it. He died, and that's all you need to know. So Hong Kong citizens, they've always been like protest crazy or pro-protesting because I think they see the contrast of what the freedom that they're living in and in what's in China, and they're not taking it lying down. So for instance, in 2003, they fought legislation that would have punished speaking out against China. China's so sensitive. And then in 2014, they filled
Snowflakes the country.
Yeah, they filled the streets for protesting, or they protested in the streets for weeks because China was trying to influence their elections. So Hong Kongers do not take it laying down, which is kind of cool. So now they're doing the same thing with this extradition agreement because it would just give China more power over Hong Kong, and they don't want that. So this is what's interesting about Hong Kong. So they have like their own kind of, I guess, Capitol Hill. So it's their legislative council. And they've got 70 seats with several parties. But all of the parties pretty much split down the middle with pro-China and then pro-democracy. So a lot of the pro-China are like the guys who are in government. So they have, some people are in those seats and they represent insurance, the medical industry, that kind of thing.
So let me ask you, are all the, in their legislature, are all of them democratically elected by the people, or is there, for some of them,
Which is why they have so many seats that are pro-China. Because I was like, well, that doesn't make sense. They don't elect, it's not like popular vote. They get chosen by this executive committee. I hope I'm naming it right. But they get chosen by this small amount of people, the politicians, and then the politicians represent the people from there.
Now, is it mainland China politicians or...
I think it's Hong Kongers.
Okay. So is it kind of like almost an electoral college type thing where there's direct election of the people who make the selections, or is that how it works?
I don't think that they have anything to do with it at all. But
that's encouraging.
So when the Hong Kongers vote, they only vote for 40 seats. So there you go. So it is kind of sort of.
And there's how many seats in this legislature altogether?
70. The rest are voted in by the business communities. And corporations have incentive to be friendly to China for various reasons, and so pro-China legislatures slip in there or something like that. So in Article 68 of this extradition agreement, the ultimate aim, at the end of the day, the ultimate aim of the elections is that they are chosen by the people. But China has just kind of made sure that doesn't happen. which sucks. So this never happened. Since 1997, pro-China has won the majority of the Legislative Council with less than 50% of the popular vote. Yeah. So this is by far the biggest protest against China. And the protest has caused the bill to be suspended, but not completely gone, so the protests are continuing. What's interesting even further is that a lot, like they go in the streets and interview people, and it's more young people that are protesting, and not like Antifa protesting, like real deal protesting, like for an actual cause, because in 2047 they know that their freedom is done and they'll still be alive. And they interviewed some older people who were like, yeah, I'm not going to be around. So I'm so proud of the young people for protesting. And so you look at this situation and you see how people are so willing to kind of put their lives on the line. Because I guess China could go in there. I don't know. But I mean, there was a bunch of, I saw today on the news, there was a bunch of like army, I don't know the lingo, army trucks.
Well, that could be. There's a lot of army vehicles that you could tentatively describe as
army-looking vehicles that were intimidating were lined up on the street, and so what's interesting to me, what I thought about, is the fact that these people are putting their lives on the line for liberty, and how badly they want it, even knowing that in so and so many years, China's going to come and take over Hong Kong anyway, but they still want those years where we want you out of our lives and we want to live in freedom, and they want democracy. And it's just paralleling the two, and how people in America are living in the freedom that Hong Kongers are not going to have in 2047, and we're so willing to give it up. And it's just like, freedom is worth dying for. Exactly. Freedom is worth, like, I'd rather be...
The founders clearly they thought that.
Exactly. Like, give me liberty or give me death. And I think there's something to that, especially when you hear what happens in North Korea, the things that happen in China. People aren't allowed to worship. And the reason why the founders came over here in the first place, the pilgrims, is they wanted to worship freely. And that kind of kept going on through the generations till you have the founding fathers. And then somewhere along the way, we lost that. But it's just interesting because you see what the price of freedom really is with these young people in Hong Kong. It's kind of my takeaway from it.
And I want to point out, since China and North Korea got brought up, that it's why it's important to remember when we're talking about kind of gun issues in the United States, that anything you can do with that has trade-offs. Because North Korea, from available statistics, which probably are not accurate considering I doubt North Korea has much incentive to provide accurate information on this to the public. But as far as we can tell, there's basically no private gun ownership in North Korea, but the murder rate's very low.
Mission accomplished.
So if you're cool with basically not being able to do anything and having to worship Kim Jong-un, I think that's the one we're on now.
Yep. Fatty.
The Rocket Man.
Yeah.
But so yeah, if you're willing to basically have to be at risk of all of your rights being suppressed and be a slave to the state, then sure, you can completely get rid of guns. And that fortunately has not been the result yet in all of the places that have limited firearm ownership. But it's to say that it's not a substantial risk of being the end result is just not borne out by the facts. We know what's happened in North Korea, China. Something tells me that they don't have much civilian fire. And let me actually ask you this thing, correct me if I'm wrong, but does Hong Kong, are they allowed private firearm ownership?
I want to say no, because I just don't see Asians with guns. In 2017, it says the estimated total number of guns held by civilians in Hong Kong is 265,000.
265. What's the population of Hong Kong?
Hey, listen, you're asking a lot of questions here, Hannah. They're Asian, so it's a lot of them.
Country, but if there's
7.4 million in 2017. That's a lot of people, and then very little bit of guns.
Yeah, that's. I don't know what the rate is necessarily compared to other countries, but that does sound like a very low.
300 million.
Yeah, something like that. Now Now we are kind of the United States, kind of the outlier in this because as liberals love to report with horror in their voice, the United States has more guns than people. You know, that makes me happy personally.
I was gonna say, you know what? I have no problem with that. I'm sure you know this. Maybe you don't. But when the Japanese were going to invade America, they were like, oh no, we can't really do that because there's going to be a gun behind every blade of grass. The amount of guns in this country made us safer.
And I think people take that for granted because, like, even in a lot of these countries where if you look at the data, well, people try to argue like, well, Western European nations don't have this problem in mass shooting, I've seen some data that actually maybe contradicts that claim, but let's assume for the moment that it's accurate. There's still a lot of trade-offs that you had to deal with from not having civilian firearm ownership. And if you want to point to Western Europe, well, look, they seem to be doing okay. Well, maybe now, but look at all the instances they had of horrible tyranny throughout the 20th century. Like, people who want to say that tyranny can't happen here, they're so naive. They're ignorant of history.
Yeah.
And it always is interesting to me. The same people who will say that Trump is literally Hitler and that we literally have neo-Nazis running around are the same people who like, oh, and also the government should take away our guns.
Let's have a buyback program and give them all of the guns.
Yeah, I'm like,
That makes sense.
I'm like, those two ideas don't. I mean, if you actually believe both of those two things at the same time, like, if I can mimic the meme that has gone around, I don't know what to tell you, just not that smart. So,
well, that goes back to Hong Kong. So this is the reason why I think, I'm like, you know, do what you have to do, Hong Kong, because that's what Americans did. The thing is that I'm not for, like, for instance, when the Venezuela thing was going on, I was not for us sending troops to Venezuela to help them. And not to be lacking compassion, but I was like, every people group, they have to take their freedom just like Americans did. And I don't think having Americans go in and take the freedom for them and say, okay, now here you go, deal with it, is helping. It hasn't helped so far. And so when I see what these Hong Kongers are doing, I'm like, well, good for them. And I haven't seen any instances of like violence or them like ripping heads off of cops and stuff like that. It's just they're in the streets and they're literally holding signs and they're like, nope, we're not dealing with this. And yeah, I'm sure it's probably some violence here and there, but for the most part, it's mostly you will hear us and you will not come and take our liberties from us. And I can really respect that, and I wish more countries would do that. And yeah, that means that you may die. A lot of Americans died. Or colonists, and I think if it happened here, where the government would try to take our liberties, I would be all for giving my life for that personally. And that's kind of what I'm seeing from the Hong Kongers. So I'm like, maybe they could be a little better, but I don't see how them change or trying to be a little bit more diplomatic is going to help anything.
Well,
They're not killing people.
Well, and the thing I guess that's the thing that kind of is interesting to me, because if it really is like when 2047 that China is going to get back formal control of that country, I don't see how without some kind of change to that agreement or formal intervention from another country, I don't see how Hong Kong maintains their freedom without basically using some violence at that point, because there'd have to be some drastic changes in the political landscape in China for
They
them.
all have to leave.
Exactly, for China to be to accept the idea of Hong Kong staying a free and independent nation once they've got an agreement in their hands that says, oh, well, you belong to us now. And so I think at some point, if there's not a change in the political situation, I think probably at some point there is going to have to be violence. Thank you all so much for watching this episode of the Liberty Cadre podcast. I am the Liberty Ambassador Matthew Cobb. This is Liberty Cadre Editor-in-Chief Nzinga Johnson.
Yes, so we want to continue to do this. We want to do it on a regular basis, okay? But this is the problem. We need stuff, okay? We need lights. We need cameras. We need action. There's going to be a link below. Go to that link, type in a dollar amount.
Send.
Whatever money you were going to take and give to, the Daily Wire or Blaze TV or so. Thank you all so much for watching. We will talk to you again soon. I mean, it's good for the purpose of use. I mean, if you're actually trying to be like, official army, you need to stand up and do the whole attention.